Story 1. She clutched his photo. Tears streaming down her face as she remembered the life they once shared. He was gone now, forever. And she was left alone with only memories of what could have been. Story 2. The rain beat down on her as she stood at the graveside, saying goodbye to her beloved husband. She couldn't bear the thought of going home to an empty house, but life had to go on without him. Story 3. He watched as she walked away, her figure growing smaller and smaller until she disappeared completely. He knew he had lost her forever, and he was left with nothing but regret for all the things he never said. Story 4. The hospital room was silent, except for the sound of the heart monitor. She knew it was only a matter of time before her father was gone, leaving her to face the world without him. Story 5. The sun set on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the beach where they had spent so many happy summers together. But now she was alone, watching the waves wash away her memories one by one. Story 6. The house was empty, and she knew it would never be the same. Her husband had left her, taking with him all the love and happiness they had shared. Now she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. Story 7. He sat at his desk, staring at the photo of his family. It had been years since he had seen them, and he wondered if they even remembered him. His heart ached with the knowledge that he would never be able to hold them again. Story 8. The sound of the train whistle echoed through the night, reminding her of the day she had said goodbye to her son. He had gone off to war, and she had never seen him again. Now, all she had were the memories of his smiling face. Story 9. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection of the woman she had become. Her beauty had faded with age, and she wondered if anyone would ever love her again. The loneliness was almost too much to bear. Story 10. The room was silent except for the sound of her sobs. She had lost the love of her life, and now she was faced with the daunting task of starting over. The future seemed bleak, and she didn't know how she would ever find happiness again. Story 11. The wind howled outside, matching the agony in her heart. She had just received the news that her child had been taken by an illness, and now she was left to mourn the loss of a life that had barely begun. Story 12. The memories of their first date played in her mind, like a movie, but now, as she sat alone in the restaurant they had visited so many times, she realized that their love had been nothing more than a fleeting moment in time. Story 13. The sound of the rain tapping against the window was the only comfort she had. Her best friend, the one who had always been there for her, had passed away, and she was left to navigate the world alone. Story 14. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as the judge read out the verdict. Her husband, the man she had trusted with her heart, had been found guilty of a crime that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. Story 15. The world was a blur. As she stumbled through the funeral procession, her father, the one person who had always been there for her, was gone forever. The thought of never seeing him again was too much to bear. Story 16. The room was filled with the scent of roses, but all she could smell was the stale air of the hospital. Her mother had passed away, and she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered family. Story 17. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the empty park. She had been stood up on her first date, and now she realized that love was not something she would find easily. Story 18. The empty crib was a constant reminder of the baby that should have been there. The stillbirth had robbed her of the chance to hold her child, and now she was left with nothing but emptiness. Story 19. The sound of the phone ringing shattered the silence of the night. It was her sister, calling to tell her that their father had passed away. The pain was almost too much to bear. Story 20. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was the only solace she had. Her marriage had ended in divorce, and now she was left to wonder where it had all gone wrong. Story 21. The sound of the car crash echoed through her mind. She had lost her best friend, the one who had always been there for her, in an instant. Now she was left to grieve the loss of a life that had been taken too soon. Story 22. The rain poured down in sheets, matching the tears streaming down her face. Her dog, her constant companion for over a decade, had passed away. She was left to face the world alone. Story 23. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in her mind. Her brother, the one who had always protected her, had been killed in the line of duty. Now she was left to mourn the loss of a hero. Story 24. The smell of his cologne still lingered in the air. But he was gone. Her husband had passed away, leaving her to face a world that no longer held any meaning. Story 25. The room was filled with people, but she was alone. Her friends and family had all moved on, leaving her to deal with the aftermath of a failed marriage on her own. Story 26. The snowflakes fell gently from the sky, but she couldn't find the beauty in them anymore. Her daughter had been taken from her in a car accident, and now she was left to navigate a world without her. Story 27. The sound of the creaking swing set brought tears to her eyes. Her daughter, the one who had loved to play there, had died of a sudden illness. Now she was left with nothing but memories of a life that was too short. Story 28. The empty house was a constant reminder of the life she had lost. Her husband had left her, taking with him all the love and happiness they had shared. Now she was left to pick up the pieces on her own. Story 29. The hospital room was quiet, except for the sound of her husband's labored breathing. He was dying, and she was left to watch as he slipped away, leaving her alone with her grief. Story 30. The sound of the ambulance siren wailed in the distance. Her son had been in a terrible accident, and she didn't know if he would ever recover. The fear was overwhelming. Story 31. The empty playground was a reminder of the child that had been taken too soon. Her daughter had been killed in a school shooting, and now she was left with nothing but the pain of a loss that could never be replaced. Story 32. The smell of his cologne filled the room, but he wasn't there. Her husband had left her for another woman, leaving her to pick up the pieces of a shattered marriage. Story 33. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was the only comfort she had. Her son had joined the military and was deployed overseas. The fear of never seeing him again was almost too much to bear. Story 34. The empty chair at the dinner table was a constant reminder of the life that had been lost. Her father had passed away, leaving a hole in her heart that would never be filled. Story 35. The sound of the clock ticking seemed to echo in her empty house. Her husband had passed away, and now she was left with nothing but the memories of a life that had been cut short. Story 36. The darkness was suffocating. Matching the grief in her heart, her brother had committed suicide, leaving her to wonder if there was anything she could have done to prevent it. Story 37. The sound of the rain tapping against the window was the only company she had. Her best friend had moved away, leaving her feeling alone and isolated. Story 38. The empty crib was a reminder of the child that had never been born. the miscarriage had left her with a pain that seemed to never fade. Story 39. The sound of the phone ringing shattered the silence of the night. It was her mother, calling to tell her that her father had passed away. The loss was overwhelming. Story 40. The snow had turned the world white, but she couldn't find any joy in it. Her husband had died in a car accident, leaving her to raise their children alone. Story 41. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as the judge read out the verdict. Her son had been found guilty of a crime that would keep him in prison for the rest of his life. The shame was almost too much to bear. Story 42. The sound of the wind howling outside matched the turmoil in her heart. Her husband had been unfaithful, leaving her to wonder if their love had ever been real. Story 43. The empty room was a constant reminder of the child that had left for college. The house felt too quiet without him, and she missed him more than words could express. Story 44. The sound of the ambulance siren seemed to grow louder. With each passing moment, her mother had fallen ill, and she didn't know if she would make it through the night. Story 45. The sound of the piano playing filled the room, but she couldn't find any comfort in it. Her husband, the one who had played so beautifully, had died of a sudden heart attack. Story 46. The empty desk was a constant reminder of the colleague that had passed away. The office felt too quiet without her, and the loss was felt by everyone. Story 47. The sound of the clock ticking seemed to echo in her mind. Her husband had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and she didn't know how to cope with the pain of losing him. Story 48. The empty space in the bed was a constant reminder of the love that had been lost. Her partner had left her, leaving her to wonder if she would ever find happiness again. Story 49. The sound of the rain tapping against the window was the only thing that seemed to make sense. Her child had been diagnosed with a chronic illness, and she didn't know how to cope with the fear of the unknown. Story 50. The darkness seemed to envelop her, matching the pain in her heart. Her best friend had died of cancer, leaving her to mourn the loss of a life that had been taken too soon. Story 51. The sound of the empty swing set squeaking in the wind seemed to taunt her. Her daughter had died in a freak accident, leaving her with a pain that seemed to never end. Story 52. The empty house echoed with the memories of a life that was no longer there. Her parents had both passed away, leaving her feeling lost and alone. Story 53. The sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore brought no solace. Her partner had drowned in a boating accident, and she was left with nothing but the pain of a life that had been cut short. Story 54. The empty chair at the dining table was a constant reminder of the love that had been lost. Her partner had died in a plane crash, leaving her to navigate the world without him. Story 55. The sound of the phone ringing seemed to herald the bad news she had been expecting. Her father had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and she didn't know how to face the inevitable loss. Story 56. The empty bedroom was a constant reminder of the child that had left for college. Her life felt empty without him, and she missed him more than she ever thought possible. Story 57. the sound of the rain tapping against the window matched the tears that streamed down her face. Her beloved pet had passed away, leaving her heart broken and alone. Story 58. The empty sanctuary was a constant reminder of the loss the community had experienced. A beloved member had passed away, leaving a hole that could never be filled. Story 59. The sound of the hospital machines beeping seemed to mimic the rhythm of her breaking heart. Her spouse had been in a terrible accident, and she didn't know if they would ever recover. Story 60. The empty classroom was a constant reminder of the student that had taken their own life. The school felt too quiet without them, and the loss was felt by everyone. Story 61. The sound of the church bells ringing seemed to echo through her soul. Her husband had died unexpectedly, leaving her to wonder how she could continue on without him. Story 62. The empty crib was a constant reminder of the child she had lost. The stillbirth had left her with a pain that seemed too much to bear. Story 63. The sound of the train passing by seemed to symbolize the journey she was now alone on. Her partner had left her, leaving her to raise their child alone. Story 64. The empty hospital room was a constant reminder of the loved one who had passed away. The grief was overwhelming, and she couldn't imagine life without them. Story 65. The sound of the wind howling outside seemed to match the pain in her heart. Her friend had been in a fatal car accident, leaving her with a hole that could never be filled. Story 66. The empty space on the couch was a constant reminder of the person who was no longer there. The grief was all-consuming, and she didn't know how to move on without them. Story 67. The sound of the silence was deafening. Her child had been diagnosed with a rare disease, and she didn't know how to help them. Story 68. The empty seat at the table was a constant reminder of the person she had lost. The loneliness was overwhelming, and she didn't know how to fill the void. Story 69. The sound of the rain tapping against the window seemed to match the tears that streamed down her face. Her grandparent had passed away, leaving her heart broken and alone. Story 70. The empty photo album was a constant reminder of the memories she had lost. The house had burned down, and she was left with nothing but ashes and grief. Story 71. The sound of the funeral procession seemed to match the heaviness in her heart. Her sister had passed away, leaving her to navigate life without her best friend. Story 72. The empty park bench was a constant reminder of the person who used to sit there. Her father had passed away, leaving her with an ache that never seemed to go away. Story 73. The sound of the clock ticking seemed to mimic the time that was slipping away. Her mother had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and she didn't know how to make the most of the time they had left. Story 74. The empty office was a constant reminder of the coworker who had passed away. The team felt incomplete without them, and the loss was felt by everyone. Story 75. The sound of the ambulance siren seemed to signal the end. Her husband had been battling cancer for years, and she didn't know how to let him go. Story 76. The empty beach was a constant reminder of the memories they had shared. Her best friend had passed away in a drowning accident, leaving her with a grief that never seemed to lessen. Story 77. The sound of the baby's cries seemed to intensify the sadness in her heart. Her miscarriage had left her with a pain that was indescribable. Story 78. The empty bed was a constant reminder of the person who used to sleep there. Her partner had left her for someone else, leaving her with a broken heart. Story 79. The sound of the airplane engine seemed to symbolize the distance that now separated them. Her best friend had moved away, leaving her feeling alone and lost. Story 80. The empty pew was a constant reminder of the person who used to sit there. Her grandmother had passed away, leaving her with a deep sense of loss. Story 81. The sound of the violin playing seemed to capture the sadness in her heart. Her husband had left her for another woman, leaving her alone with their broken dreams. Story 82. The empty classroom was a constant reminder of the student who had passed away. The school was in mourning, and the loss was felt by everyone. Story 83. The sound of the wind seemed to carry the whispers of the loved one she had lost. Her sister had died in a car accident, leaving her with a pain that never seemed to go away. Story 84. The empty street corner was a constant reminder of the homeless man who used to sit there. The man had passed away, and the community felt the loss of a friend. Story 85. The sound of the rain pounding against the roof seemed to match the pain in her heart. Her dog had died, leaving her with a loneliness she never imagined. Story 86. The empty locker was a constant reminder of the student who had taken their own life. The school was in shock, and the community was left wondering how they could have prevented it. Story 87. The sound of the clock ticking seemed to mimic the time that was slipping away. Her friend was battling a terminal illness, and she didn't know how to say goodbye. Story 88. The empty driveway was a constant reminder of the car that was never coming back. Her son had died in a car accident, leaving her with a grief that felt unbearable. Story 89. The sound of the church choir singing seemed to offer comfort in her grief. Her mother had passed away, and she found solace in the memories of their time together. Story 90. The empty rocking chair was a constant reminder of the grandmother who used to sit there. Her passing had left a void in the family, and they struggled to find their way without her. Story 91. The sound of the hospital machines seemed to drown out everything else. Her child had been diagnosed with a rare disease, and she didn't know how to handle the news. Story 92. The empty office chair was a constant reminder of the coworker who had been let go. The team felt the loss of their friend and wondered why they had been fired. Story 93. The sound of the car engine seemed to carry the weight of the goodbye. Her sister was moving to another country, and she didn't know when she would see her again. Story 94. The empty playground was a constant reminder of the child who had been bullied. The community was in mourning, wondering how they could have prevented the tragedy. Story 95. The sound of the wind howling seemed to amplify her sadness. Her partner had passed away, leaving her with a grief that was all-consuming. Story 96. The empty studio was a constant reminder of the artist who had left the world. The community was in shock, and the art world lost a talented creator. Story 97. The sound of the train whistling seemed to represent the distance between them. Her best friend had moved to another state, and she missed her terribly. Story 98. The empty theater seat was a constant reminder of the friend who had passed away. The community mourned the loss of a talented actor and a kind-hearted person. Story 99. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore seemed to mirror the turmoil in her heart. Her marriage had ended, leaving her feeling adrift and alone. Story 100. The empty desk was a constant reminder of the colleague who had retired. The team missed their friend and wondered how they would carry on without their expertise. Story 101. The sound of the ambulance siren seemed to mark the end of her world. Her mother had suffered a heart attack and was fighting for her life in the hospital. Story 102. The empty bedroom was a constant reminder of the child who had grown up and moved out. The house felt quieter and emptier without them. Story 103. The sound of the wind chimes seemed to echo the emptiness she felt inside. Her best friend had passed away, and she didn't know how to go on without her. Story 104. The empty sports field was a constant reminder of the athlete who had passed away. The team was in shock, and the community mourned the loss of a talented player. Story 105. The sound of the church bells ringing seemed to offer solace in her grief. Her father had passed away, and she struggled to come to terms with his death. Story 106. The empty restaurant table was a constant reminder of the friend who had canceled their plans. She felt disappointed and alone, wondering why her friend had changed their mind. Story 107. The sound of the rain tapping against the window seemed to match her sadness. Her pet had passed away, and she felt a deep sense of loss. Story 108. The empty bookshelf was a constant reminder of the friend who had moved away. She missed their conversations and wondered when they would see each other again. Story 109. The sound of the piano playing seemed to capture the melancholy in her heart. Her grandfather had passed away, and she felt a profound sense of sadness. Story 110. The empty parking space was a constant reminder of the friend who had passed away in a car accident. The community was in shock and grieved the loss of a young life. Story 111. The sound of the clock ticking seemed to amplify her loneliness. Her partner had left her, and she didn't know how to move on from the breakup. Story 112. The empty swing set was a constant reminder of the child who had been taken too soon. The community mourned the loss of a young life and wondered why such a tragedy had occurred. Story 113. The sound of the violin playing seemed to capture the sorrow in her heart. Her friend had passed away, and she struggled to find comfort in their memories. Story 114. The empty office cubicle was a constant reminder of the colleague who had resigned. The team missed their friend and wondered what had led them to leave the company. Story 115. The sound of the church choir singing seemed to offer hope in her despair. Her sibling had been diagnosed with a serious illness, and she prayed for their recovery. Story 116. The empty hospital bed was a constant reminder of the loved one who had passed away. The family grieved the loss of their relative and struggled to come to terms with their absence. Story 117. The sound of the fire crackling seemed to intensify her grief. Her home had been destroyed in a natural disaster, and she felt like she had lost a part of herself. Story 118. The empty hiking trail was a constant reminder of the friend who had gone missing. The community searched for the missing hiker and hoped for their safe return. Story 119. The sound of the trumpet playing seemed to express the sadness in her heart. Her mentor had passed away, and she felt a deep sense of loss. Story 120. The empty seat at the dinner table was a constant reminder of the family member who had passed away. The family mourned their loss and remembered the good times they shared together. Story 121. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore seemed to match her tumultuous emotions. Her relationship had ended abruptly, and she struggled to find closure. Story 122. The empty dance floor was a constant reminder of the friend who had left the party early. She wondered if something had happened and hoped her friend was safe. Story 123. The sound of the wind howling seemed to reflect the turbulence she felt inside. Her house had been burglarized, and she no longer felt safe in her own home. Story 124. The empty desk at work was a constant reminder of the colleague who had passed away unexpectedly. The team was in shock and mourned the loss of a valued member. Story 125. The sound of the church bell tolling seemed to mark the end of an era. Her grandfather had passed away, and she mourned the loss of a patriarch of the family. Story 126. The empty playground was a constant reminder of the child who had moved away. She missed the sound of their laughter and hoped they were happy in their new home. Story 127. The sound of the guitar playing seemed to capture the sadness in her heart. Her favorite musician had passed away, and she felt like a part of her childhood had died with them. Story 128. The empty stage was a constant reminder of the actor who had passed away. The theater community grieved the loss of a talented performer. Story 129. The sound of the thunder rumbling seemed to add to her unease. Her friend had disappeared, and she feared the worst. Story 130. The empty pew was a constant reminder of the friend who had stopped attending church. She wondered what had led to their absence and hoped they were okay. Story 131. The sound of the rain tapping against the window seemed to match the tears streaming down her face. Her beloved pet had passed away, and she missed their comforting presence. Story 132. The empty locker was a constant reminder of the student who had dropped out of school. The teachers and classmates wondered what had happened and hoped they were okay. Story 133. The sound of the ambulance siren wailing seemed to amplify her anxiety. Her family member had been rushed to the hospital, and she prayed for their recovery. Story 134. The empty restaurant booth was a constant reminder of the friend who had moved away. She missed their conversations over coffee and hoped they would stay in touch. Story 135. The sound of the whistle blowing seemed to signal the end of a chapter. Her job had been terminated, and she felt uncertain about her future. Story 136. The empty gallery wall was a constant reminder of the artist who had passed away. The art community mourned the loss of a creative mind. Story 137. The sound of the clock ticking seemed to make her feel like time was running out. Her parent had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and she cherished every moment they had left. Story 138. The empty parking spot was a constant reminder of the friend who had moved to a new city. She missed their impromptu adventures and hoped they would visit soon. Story 139. The sound of the flute playing seemed to express the melancholy in her heart. Her best friend had betrayed her, and she struggled to come to terms with the loss of their friendship. Story 140. The empty sanctuary was a constant reminder of the church that had closed its doors. The congregation mourned the loss of their spiritual home. Story 141. The sound of the typewriter clacking seemed to capture the loneliness she felt. Her grandfather had passed away, and she missed his stories and wisdom. Story 142. The empty swing set was a constant reminder of the child who had passed away. The community grieved the loss of a young life. Story 143. The sound of the phone ringing seemed to bring a sense of dread. Her partner had been in an accident, and she waited anxiously for news of their condition. Story 144. The empty seat at the dinner table was a constant reminder of the family member who had passed away. The family mourned the loss of a loved one. Story 145. The sound of the violin playing seemed to convey the sadness in her heart. Her dream of becoming a musician had been shattered by an injury. Story 146. The empty shelf was a constant reminder of the friend who had moved away. She missed their shared love of books and hoped they were doing well. Story 147. The sound of the car engine revving seemed to fuel her anger. Her ex-partner had betrayed her, and she struggled to move on from the pain. Story 148. The empty classroom was a constant reminder of the teacher who had retired. The students and staff thanked them for their years of dedication and wished them well in their next chapter. Story 149. The sound of the choir singing seemed to lift her spirits. Her friend had recovered from an illness, and she was grateful for their renewed health. Story 150. The empty crib was a constant reminder of the child they had lost. The parents grieved the loss of their little one. Story 151. The sound of the wind howling seemed to mirror her despair. Her home had been destroyed in a natural disaster, and she struggled to pick up the pieces. Story 152. The empty stage was a constant reminder of the performer who had passed away. The theater community mourned the loss of a talented artist. Story 153. The sound of the dog barking seemed to exacerbate her loneliness. Her free companion had passed away, and she missed their constant companionship. Story 154. The empty chair at the meeting was a constant reminder of the colleague who had retired. The team wished them a happy retirement and thanked them for their contributions. Story 155. The sound of the rain pounding against the roof seemed to match the anger in her heart. Her friend had betrayed her trust, and she struggled to forgive them. Story 156. The empty locker was a constant reminder of the student who had been expelled. The teachers and classmates hoped they would learn from their mistakes and make better choices. Story 157. The sound of the ambulance speeding away seemed to signify the end of an era. Her elderly relative had passed away, and she mourned the loss of a loved one. Story 158. The empty chair at the dinner table was a constant reminder of the family member who was serving in the military. The family missed them dearly and hoped for their safe return. Story 159. The sound of the guitar playing seemed to express the sadness in her heart. Her partner had broken up with her, and she struggled to move on from the heartbreak. Story 160. The empty park bench was a constant reminder of the friend who had moved to another country. She missed their walks and talks and hoped to see them again someday. Story 161. The sound of the clock ticking seemed to amplify her anxiety. She had an important exam coming up, and she feared failure. Story 162. The empty spot on the couch was a constant reminder of the pet who had passed away. The family missed their furry friend and cherished their memories together. Story 163. The sound of the construction work outside seemed to add to her frustration. Her plans for the day were ruined by the noise pollution. Story 164. The empty photo frame was a constant reminder of the loved one who had passed away. She kept their memory alive by looking at old photographs and reminiscing about their time together. Story 165. The sound of the car honking seemed to irritate her. Her commute was always filled with traffic, and she longed for a quieter, simpler life. Story 166. The empty parking spot was a constant reminder of the friend who had moved away. She missed their spontaneous road trips and hoped to make new memories with them someday. Story 167. The sound of the phone vibrating seemed to add to her worry. Her loved one was in the hospital, and she awaited updates on their condition. Story 168. The empty bed was a constant reminder of the partner who had passed away. She grieved their loss and held onto their memory. Story 169. The sound of the thunder rumbling seemed to match her sadness. Her plans for the day were ruined by the stormy weather, and she struggled to find joy in the gloomy day. Story 170. The empty desk was a constant reminder of the colleague who had moved to a different department. The team missed their valuable contributions and wished them well in their new role. Story 171. The sound of the train departing seemed to mirror her loneliness. Her loved one had left on a long journey, and she missed their presence. Story 172. The empty bookshelf was a constant reminder of the book lover who had passed away. Her friends and family cherished her memory by sharing their favorite stories. Story 173. The sound of the baby crying seemed to add to her exhaustion. She was a new mother and struggled to balance the demands of motherhood with her own needs. Story 174. The empty chair at the restaurant was a constant reminder of the friend who had canceled last minute. She felt disappointed and alone, wishing for the company of her friend. Story 175. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees seemed to match her sadness. She had lost her job and struggled to make ends meet. Story 176. The empty podium was a constant reminder of the leader who had resigned. The community wished them well in their future endeavors and thanked them for their service. Story 177. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore seemed to amplify her grief. Her loved one had passed away, and she found solace in the peaceful yet powerful natural element. Story 178. The empty swing was a constant reminder of the child who had moved away. The parent missed their laughter and playful energy. Story 179. The sound of the alarm clock ringing seemed to signify the start of another dull day. She longed for adventure and excitement, but felt trapped in her mundane routine. Story 180. The empty bus seat was a constant reminder of the stranger who had shown her kindness. She felt grateful for the small act of compassion and hoped to pay it forward someday. Story 181. The sound of the violin playing seemed to match her sorrow. She attended a funeral for a friend who had passed away, and the mournful melody brought tears to her eyes. Story 182. The empty playground was a constant reminder of the child who had grown up. She missed the innocence and joy of childhood, wishing for simpler times. Story 183. The sound of the rain tapping against the window seemed to add to her melancholy. She felt overwhelmed by the stresses of life and longed for a break from it all. Story 184. The empty kitchen was a constant reminder of the chef who had retired. The family enjoyed their favorite dishes in honor of the talented cook. Story 185. The sound of the ambulance siren seemed to amplify her anxiety. She feared for the safety of her loved one and prayed for their well-being. Story 186. The empty stage was a constant reminder of the performer who had moved on. The audience clapped for their memorable performances and wished them success in their future endeavors. Story 187. The sound of the church bells ringing seemed to match her regret. She wished she had spent more time with her loved ones before they had passed away. Story 188. The empty car seat was a constant reminder of the child who had left for college. The parent missed their company and eagerly awaited their visits home. Story 189. The sound of the computer keyboard clicking seemed to add to her stress. She had a tight deadline for her work project and felt the pressure mounting. Story 190. The empty gym was a constant reminder of the athlete who had retired. The community celebrated their achievements and wished them happiness in their retirement. Story 191. The sound of the phone ringing seemed to match her dread. She knew it was bad news before she even answered. Story 192. The empty park bench was a constant reminder of the friend who had moved away. She missed their conversations and the laughter they shared. Story 193. The sound of the church choir singing seemed to amplify her guilt. She had missed too many Sundays and felt disconnected from her faith. Story 194. The empty museum exhibit was a constant reminder of the artist who had passed away. The visitors admired the works of the talented creator and paid tribute to their legacy. Story 195. The sound of the construction work outside seemed to add to her frustration. She couldn't concentrate on her work with the constant noise disrupting her thoughts. Story 196. The empty bookstore was a constant reminder of the bookseller who had retired. The regular customers fondly remembered their recommendations and thanked them for their service. Story 197. The sound of the ambulance siren seemed to match her despair. She had lost a loved one and felt overwhelmed by the grief. Story 198. The empty parking spot was a constant reminder of the friend who had canceled their plans. She felt disappointed and alone, wishing for the company of her friend. Story 199. The sound of the clock ticking seemed to add to her anxiety. She had a job interview in an hour and worried about making a good impression. Story 200. The empty photo frame was a constant reminder of the loved one who had passed away. She treasured their memory and held on to their photograph with love.